Day 26, February 27th, 2026. The FBI just released Nancy Guthrie's home back to her family. The crime scene tape is coming down. And according to kidnapping survivor Elizabeth Smart, when you reach this point, the statistical reality is devastating. This is Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, mother of Today show host Savannah Guthrie. She vanished from her Tucson, Arizona home on February 1st, 2026, taken in the middle of the night by a masked intruder caught on her doorbell camera. 26 days later, there's still no suspect, no arrest. And now, the FBI has made a decision that signals a fundamental shift in this investigation. Let's talk about what happened on day 26, what it means when a crime scene gets released, and the brutal truth about kidnapping statistics that nobody wants to hear. Before we get to the announcement, we need to understand what happened on day 25. Because what NewsNation's cameras captured on Wednesday, February 25th, tells us everything about where this investigation stands. 9:15 a.m. Unmarked white vehicles arrive at Nancy Guthrie's home. Then, at 10:08, multiple black SUVs pull up. More than 6 individuals, some dressed in suits, enter and exit through the garage. NewsNation's drone footage captured something that wouldn't be officially announced for another 24 hours. The FBI was conducting their final sweep of the crime scene, up to a dozen investigators, several hours on site, and they focused on one specific area, the front door and porch where a trail of Nancy's blood was discovered. Not just drops, a trail. That detail matters. A blood trail indicates movement. It suggests Nancy was dragged or carried from inside her home to the exterior. It corroborates what investigators have believed from day one. This was a violent abduction. At one point during the sweep, a vehicle with tinted windows pulled directly into Nancy's garage. The door closed. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't for public view. This is standard procedure during a final evidence collection. When you're removing items that need to remain confidential, whether that's DNA samples, forensic photographs, or sealed evidence containers, you don't do it in the open where cameras can document every detail. And then, NewsNation spotted something particularly telling. Investigators standing inside Nancy's foyer, looking out toward the porch. Think about that for a moment. They positioned themselves in the exact spot where Nancy would have been when that masked suspect appeared at her door. The same vantage point, the same perspective. This is called spatial analysis. Investigators are trying to understand what Nancy could have seen through her doorbell camera display, what she might have heard, whether she opened the door willingly or if it was forced. Every detail of that physical space, the sight lines, the distances, the angles, helps reconstruct what happened in those final moments before Nancy disappeared. So that was day 25, the final sweep, the last time FBI agents would process Nancy Guthrie's home as an active crime scene. Because 24 hours later, everything changed. On Thursday, February 26th, day 26 of the search, NBC News broke the story. Authorities are planning to turn Nancy Guthrie's home back over to the family and no longer seal it off as a crime scene, according to 2 federal law enforcement sources. The home where Nancy was abducted is being released. The family can return to it. The yellow crime scene tape is coming down. Now, if you're not familiar with how criminal investigations work, this might sound like good news. The family gets their mother's home back. They can finally access the property. But in the world of forensic investigation, this is actually a significant and sobering milestone. When law enforcement releases a crime scene, it means one of 3 things. 1, they've collected every piece of evidence they believe exists at that location. 2, they no longer expect to find the victim at or near the property. 3, the investigation is transitioning from an active crime scene phase to a different type of case entirely. In Nancy's situation, it's likely all 3. Let me be very clear about what this signals. The FBI doesn't release a crime scene if they think there's any chance the victim is still in the immediate area. They don't give up control of a property if they expect new evidence to emerge there. This decision tells us that after 26 days, hundreds of investigators, and multiple sweeps of the property, law enforcement believes they've gotten everything they're going to get from Nancy's home. So what did they collect? We know they found Nancy's blood at the entrance, a trail of it, indicating she was moved against her will. They recovered mixed DNA from the property, DNA that doesn't match Nancy or anyone close to her. That DNA is currently being analyzed using genetic genealogy, a process that Sheriff Chris Nanos said could take weeks, months, or maybe a year. They documented the doorbell camera footage showing the masked suspect. They analyzed the spatial layout. They processed every room, every surface, every potential point of entry or exit. And now, they're done. For the Guthrie family, this is bittersweet. They can finally return to their mother's home. They can go through her belongings, retrieve family photos, begin the painful process of sorting through a life interrupted. But they're returning to a house that was a crime scene for nearly a month. A house where their mother's blood still marks the entrance. A house that will never feel the same. Earlier this week, kidnapping survivor and activist Elizabeth Smart was asked on a podcast whether the Nancy Guthrie case triggers her. Her response was brutally honest. She said, "I'm not triggered by it. I'm not. But I know like what law enforcement will tell you. If a person disappears and they're not found within the first 24 to 48 hours, the chances of their survival drop down to almost 0%. I mean, it's almost like they're dead." Now, if you don't know who Elizabeth Smart is, in 2002, when she was 14 years old, she was abducted from her bedroom in Salt Lake City, Utah. She was held captive for 9 months before being rescued. She survived. She became an advocate for missing persons and child safety, and she understands kidnapping cases better than almost anyone. So when Elizabeth Smart says the statistical reality at 26 days is devastating, we need to listen. Here are the facts that law enforcement doesn't usually share publicly during an active investigation. In stranger abduction cases where the victim doesn't know their abductor, 74% of victims who are killed are dead within 3 hours of the abduction. Within the first 24 hours, that number climbs even higher. After 48 hours, the probability of finding a kidnapping victim alive drops dramatically. We're now at 26 days, 624 hours. Does this mean Nancy Guthrie is definitely deceased? No. Elizabeth Smart herself is proof that people can survive extended captivity. J.C. Dugard was held for 18 years. Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus were imprisoned for over a decade. It happens. Survival is possible, but it's statistically rare, and investigators know this. That's why, in her latest video announcing the $1 million reward, Savannah Guthrie said something she hadn't said before. She acknowledged, "We also know that she may be lost. She may already be gone. She may have already gone home to the Lord that she loves." This was the first time the family publicly acknowledged the possibility that Nancy might not be alive. After 24 days of hope, of faith, of believing in miracles, the reality is setting in. They need closure. Whether that closure is Nancy coming home alive or Nancy's body being recovered so she can have a proper burial, the family needs to know. And that's what the $1 million reward is really about. Not just finding Nancy, finding answers. There's another reason why this investigation is transitioning to a new phase. The DNA evidence has hit a roadblock. CNN reported this week that the $1 million reward is, quote, "in some ways a tacit admission that the investigation is entering a new phase as DNA evidence that once seemed promising hits roadblocks." Here's what we know. Investigators found mixed DNA at Nancy's property, biological evidence that doesn't belong to Nancy or anyone in her immediate circle. They also recovered a black glove approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. That glove appeared to visually match the gloves worn by the masked suspect in the doorbell footage. DNA from that glove was run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains profiles of more than 19 million known offenders. No match. The suspect has never been arrested for a crime that requires DNA collection, or if he has, it was before DNA collection became standard practice. So now investigators are turning to genetic genealogy. This is the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. It works by taking the unknown DNA sample and comparing it to publicly available genealogy databases like GED Match or Family Tree DNA. You're not looking for an exact match to the suspect. You're looking for distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, who share enough genetic markers to build a family tree. Then, through traditional detective work, you narrow down that family tree until you identify a potential suspect. It's incredibly powerful, but it's also incredibly time-consuming. Sheriff Chris Nanos was asked about the timeline for DNA results, and he said, "Our lab tells us that there's challenges with it. But our lab also knows that the technology is moving so fast that they think some of this stuff will resolve itself just in a matter of weeks, months, or maybe a year. Weeks, months, or maybe a year. That's the reality. Genetic genealogy isn't a quick fix. It's a painstaking process that requires specialized expertise, cooperation from genealogy databases, and a significant amount of luck. You need the suspect to have relatives who've uploaded their DNA to these databases. You need those relatives to be close enough genetically that you can build an accurate tree, and you need investigators who know how to navigate genealogical records going back generations. But here's the problem. This case needs answers now, not in a year. Nancy's family needs closure. The public needs assurance that this suspect isn't a threat to others. The investigation needs momentum, and right now, the DNA path is stuck. That's why the $1 million reward became necessary, because when the forensic leads stall, you pivot to human intelligence. You hope that someone, somewhere, knows something, and you make it financially worthwhile for them to come forward. Since the family announced the $1 million reward on February 24th, the FBI says they've received approximately 1,500 new tips. Now, before you get too excited about that number, let's put it in context. The FBI has received more than 23,000 tips total since Nancy disappeared. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has fielded over 18,000 calls. That's over 40,000 pieces of information, and yet we still don't have a suspect. The problem isn't volume, it's quality. CNN spoke to law enforcement sources who said that the tide of credible tips had begun to ebb before the $1 million reward was announced. That means most of the tips coming in were speculation, theories, premonitions, people who think they saw something but aren't sure, not actionable intelligence. In fact, the Pima County 911 dispatch manager went on record asking people to stop calling with opinions and theories. She said, "What we don't want are the opinions and the thoughts and kind of wondering, are investigators doing A, B, C, and D?" So yes, 1,500 new tips sounds impressive, but how many of those are credible? How many provide information that investigators didn't already have? How many will actually lead somewhere? We don't know. And frankly, based on the patterns we've seen, probably not many, but you only need one. One tip from someone who knows the suspect. One piece of information that breaks the case open. That's what the family is betting on. That's what the FBI is hoping for. Because right now, the traditional investigative paths, the DNA, the forensics, the surveillance analysis, have led them as far as they can go. Now let's talk about what we actually know. Let's go back to the evidence. Because despite 26 days of investigation, hundreds of agents, and 40,000 tips, the evidence we have is surprisingly limited. We know that on the night of January 31st, going into the early morning hours of February 1st, someone approached Nancy Guthrie's home. That person was captured on her doorbell camera. A male suspect, approximately 5'9" to 5'10", average build, wearing a black ski mask, black gloves, and carrying a 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack. That backpack is sold exclusively at Walmart, which means every single purchase of that model can be traced through transaction records. The suspect is also wearing a gun holster in an unusual position, between his legs, which investigators have been showing to local gun shop owners to see if anyone recognizes it or remembers selling it. The doorbell footage shows the suspect deliberately covering the camera with his gloved hand, then using nearby foliage to further conceal it. This wasn't random. This was planned. The suspect knew the camera was there and took steps to disable it before entering the property. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera disconnected. At 2:10 a.m., another camera in the house detected movement. At 2:27 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from the app on her phone. Her pacemaker. Think about what that means. Nancy wore a pacemaker for her heart condition. That device was synced to her phone, constantly monitoring her cardiac rhythm. At 2:27 in the morning, that connection dropped. Either the pacemaker was physically removed, damaged, or Nancy was taken so far from her phone that the Bluetooth connection failed. That 27-minute window from 1:47 a.m. to 2:27 a.m. is when Nancy Guthrie was abducted. 40 minutes. That's how long this took. And in those 40 minutes, Nancy bled. We know that because investigators found a trail of her blood at the entrance of the home. Not drops, a trail, which tells us there was a struggle, or Nancy was injured, or she was dragged. Whatever happened, it was violent. The next morning, Nancy didn't show up to watch a virtual church service with a friend, something she did every week. The friend called the family. Around 11 a.m., family members arrived at the house to check on her. They searched the property. No sign of Nancy. At noon, they called 911. By the time deputies arrived 15 minutes later, Nancy had already been gone for nearly 10 hours. And here's what makes this case even more complicated. We don't know for certain that all the doorbell camera images are from the same night. Two law enforcement sources told NBC News that at least one of the images released by the FBI may have been taken on a different day, possibly showing the suspect conducting reconnaissance before the actual abduction. The FBI recovered these images from Google's back-end servers because Nancy didn't have a Nest subscription, but without timestamps, they can't definitively prove when each image was captured. Sheriff Chris Nanos pushed back on this, calling it speculation. But if it's true, it means the suspect visited Nancy's property at least twice, once to scout, once to abduct. That level of planning, that level of premeditation, tells us this wasn't random. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Someone targeted Nancy Guthrie specifically. But why? That's the question that still doesn't have an answer. Nancy was an 84-year-old woman living alone. She wasn't wealthy in a way that would make her an obvious ransom target.
Yes, her daughter is a famous TV host, but Savannah Guthrie's net worth, while substantial, isn't at the level where professional kidnappers would typically see her as a target. And if this was about ransom, why has there been no verified communication from the kidnappers? Multiple media outlets have received purported ransom notes demanding Bitcoin payments.
TMZ reported one note asking for $6 million. Other notes with different amounts and different Bitcoin addresses have been sent to local news stations. But here's the critical detail. Law enforcement has not confirmed that any of these notes are legitimate. They're taking them seriously. They're investigating, but they haven't said, yes, we believe these are from the actual kidnapper. In fact, one person has already been arrested for sending a fake ransom threat in connection with the case, trying to capitalize on the situation. And TMZ reported receiving messages from someone claiming to know the kidnapper's identity and demanding $100,000 for that information. So we have real ransom notes mixed with opportunistic scammers, mixed with people seeking attention. And investigators have to sort through all of it. Which brings us to the suspects, or rather, the lack of suspects. Over the course of this investigation, law enforcement has detained at least 2 individuals for questioning. One was a delivery driver who had made deliveries to the neighborhood. He was detained, his vehicles were searched, his home was searched, and he was released. He spoke to NewsNation and said, "I hope they get the suspect that did it because I'm not it." Another man, Luke Daly, and his mother were detained on February 13th after a SWAT operation at their property in Rio Rico, Arizona, about an hour south of Tucson. Daly is a convicted felon with a drug-related record. He was questioned, released, and his lawyer has stated clearly that neither Daly nor his mother have any connection to the case. ABC News reported that investigators are leaning away from both of these men as possible suspects, which means we're back to square one. No suspect, no person of interest who's panned out, no arrests. And that's why releasing the crime scene is such a significant development. Because when you've exhausted the physical location, when you've processed every surface, collected every sample, documented every detail, and you still don't have a suspect, you have to acknowledge that the crime scene itself isn't going to solve the case. The answer is out there, in the community, in someone's memory, in a tip that hasn't come in yet. The investigation isn't over. Let me be very clear about that. The FBI, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, they're still working this case actively, but the nature of that work is changing. It's shifting from crime scene forensics to intelligence gathering, from processing evidence to building a profile, from searching Nancy's property to searching for Nancy herself. Sheriff Chris Nanos said in a statement that the case will remain an active investigation until Nancy Guthrie is found, or all leads are exhausted. That's important. They're not giving up, but they are transitioning, and part of that transition means giving the family their home back. There's another context we need to consider here. While Nancy Guthrie's case has received massive national and international attention, partly because of Savannah Guthrie's fame, there are dozens, hundreds, thousands of missing persons cases in Arizona and across the country that don't get this level of resources or media coverage. CNN published a piece this week highlighting other Tucson families who have been waiting decades for answers. Jimmy Morales disappeared in the 1990s. His sister Tacho told CNN, "I look for answers like if it was the first day, the second day, 6 months, a year, we're just never gonna give up." Marlana McIlvaine went missing in 2010. She was 28 years old, a mother of 2. Her family believes she's no longer alive, but they're still asking for help to lay her to rest. The disparity is stark. Nancy Guthrie gets 400 FBI agents, over 40,000 tips, $1 million reward from her family. These other families get a case file that sits in a drawer. And that's not a criticism of the Guthrie family or the investigation into Nancy's disappearance. It's a recognition of a systemic problem. Celebrity matters. Media attention matters. Resources follow attention. Savannah Guthrie seems to understand this. When she announced the $1 million reward, She also announced that the family is donating $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She said, "We know there are millions of families that have suffered with this kind of uncertainty. It's an acknowledgement that her family's privilege, their platform, their resources, come with a responsibility to help others who don't have those advantages." So where does the investigation go from here? What happens now that the crime scene has been released? First, the DNA analysis continues. Genetic genealogy takes time, but it works. We've seen it solve cold cases that were decades old. The DNA from Nancy's property, the DNA from that glove, if it belongs to the suspect, it will eventually lead to a name. The question is whether it happens in weeks, months, or years. Second, the tip line remains open. That $1,500 bump from the $1 million reward might include the one tip that matters. Investigators will continue to follow every credible lead, interview every potential witness, trace every connection. This is the grinding, unglamorous work of detective investigations. It's not CSI. It's thousands of hours of phone calls, database searches, interviews, and dead ends. Third, the Walmart angle. Remember that Ozark Trail backpack is sold exclusively at Walmart. Every purchase is in their system. Every transaction can be traced. If the suspect bought that backpack locally, investigators can pull transaction records, match them with surveillance footage from Walmart stores, and potentially identify the buyer. It's painstaking work, but it's doable. Fourth, the holster. That unusual gun holster position is distinctive. If the suspect purchased it locally, if he had it custom made, if he's worn it in public before, someone might recognize it. Gun shop owners throughout Tucson have been shown images. One told NBC News that the FBI visited him with a list of about 24 pictures, presumably of persons of interest. And fifth, the public. Someone knows something. That's what law enforcement believes. Whether it's a neighbor who saw something unusual, a coworker who noticed a change in behavior, a family member who has suspicions they've been afraid to voice, someone out there has information that could break this case. The $1 million reward is designed to make it worth their while to come forward, even if it means betraying someone they know. But here's the reality that nobody wants to say out loud. The longer this goes, the less likely it becomes that Nancy Guthrie will be found alive. We're at 26 days. Elizabeth Smart's statistics are damning. Every day that passes, the probability shifts further toward recovery rather than rescue. That doesn't mean the family should give up hope. Hope is what gets you through. But it does mean they need to prepare themselves for any outcome. And based on Savannah Guthrie's latest statements, it seems like they are. She's acknowledging the possibility that her mother is gone. She's asking for closure, whatever form that takes. She's being realistic while still holding on to faith. For those of you watching who want to help, here's what you can do. If you have any information, any at all, about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That's 1-800-225-5324. Or call the Pima County Sheriff's Department non-emergency line at 520-351-4900. Don't assume your information isn't important. Don't assume someone else has already called it in. Even if it seems minor, even if you're not sure it's relevant, let investigators make that determination. A detail that seems insignificant to you might be the piece that connects two other pieces they already have. And if you're in the Tucson area, if you saw anything unusual in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood on the night of January 31st or the early morning of February 1st, if you saw a vehicle that didn't belong, a person walking where they shouldn't be, anything out of the ordinary, call it in. This case is solvable. Someone abducted Nancy Guthrie. That person exists. They live somewhere, work somewhere, interact with people, they left evidence, they made mistakes, and eventually those mistakes will catch up to them. But it requires the community to step up. It requires people to overcome their fear, their reluctance, their uncertainty, and speak up. Because Nancy Guthrie is someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone's friend. She deserves to be found. Her family deserves answers. And whoever did this deserves to be held accountable. Day 26. The crime scene has been released. The investigation continues. And somewhere, someone knows what happened to Nancy Guthrie. If that someone is you, make the call. Do the right thing. Help bring Nancy home. Bring